Assalamu alaikum. Dear educators, parents, welcome to today's webinar featuring Dr. Amber Khan. Dr. Amber has dedicated the last 2 decades of her life to sharing her expertise in both medicine and Islamic teachings, aiming to assist the youth in navigating various aspects of health, physical, social, mental, reproductive, and sexual. Her tireless efforts have impacted countless lives as she continues to educate and empower communities in schools and community centers across the US. Dr. Khan has chaired the Education Committee for the Islamic Medical Association of North America since 2015, showing her dedication to enhancing healthcare within the Muslim community. We're joined with Dr. Amber. Dr. Amber, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing with us your extensive knowledge in these critical elements and subjects. So without further ado, please, the mic is yours. Jazakumullah kul khair.
Alhamdulillah wa salala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I hope everyone is doing well. And Jazakallah khair, and thank you to Brother Sharaf and Sister Bushra and to the Noor Art team. As mentioned, I am Sister Amber, and I have written a health book series called Health and Wellness from the Islamic Perspective. It includes 6 levels. And in the past webinars, we covered levels 1, 2, and 3. These tackle various topics that are relevant to our younger audience, the middle school age. And then you have levels 4, 5, and 6. We talked about level 4 last time, and these last 3 levels, levels 4, 5, and 6, they talk about topics for an older age audience, upper middle school or high school, depending on your community. These levels are much more longer and more detailed, and they get into some heavier topics. Now, we're going to do our best to cover the most important aspects of these levels, inshallah, with the time that we have. And today we are going to be discussing everything that's inside of level 5, inshallah. Now, as mentioned previously, all 6 levels include an introductory section on the topic of hayya and learning about health with that modest element. If you're interested in learning more about the introduction, please check out the previous webinars, levels 1 and 2. So now let's go ahead and take a look at everything that's inside of level 5. Level 5 includes 2 major health units. There is the reproductive health unit, and within that unit are 2 chapters called Reproductive Health Review and Genderism. And then there is the sexual health unit, which covers sexual desire and intimacy, sexual attraction, and sexual violence. I would like to note that this level does include a special content editor for the chapters on genderism and sexual attraction, and that is Dr. Wahid Jensen. He content edited those particular chapters, and I want to highlight that and also recognize him for his efforts. May Allah reward him immensely for his work, and may it be a sadaqah jariyah for him. So as mentioned, the first 2 chapters fall under the reproductive health unit. Reproductive health is about health regarding our reproductive organs, and it begins with the chapter called Reproductive Health Review. The outline for this chapter includes 4 sections. Section 1 is on changes during puberty. Section 2 is all about reproduction. Section 3 is on menstruation, and Section 4 is on hygiene. Now, this chapter is called a review because it is essentially a brief overview of level 2. If you may remember, level 2 introduces the topic of puberty to our middle school students. This chapter revisits that topic, but now at a higher and more advanced level. Now, given the time that we have and the importance of other chapters in this level, I'm actually not going to go too much into this chapter because it is meant to be a review, but there are a few things that I do want to highlight. The first is that this chapter does discuss the topic of delayed puberty. You may have a high school student, or there may be a high schooler who has not yet hit puberty and may feel like they're lagging behind, or that they're developmentally different from their peers, as a lot of the peers around them, the students around them, are going through puberty or going through the changes or finishing up puberty. But for some high schoolers, they may not really begin puberty until their high school years. So this talks a little bit about that topic, maybe perhaps feeling self-conscious, having some medical concerns about that. So that is addressed. Another topic that is addressed is the cultural stigmas that surround the topic of menstruation, whether it's learning about menstruation from a male perspective, as well as certain types of menstrual products that are used. What is the Islamic ruling on some of them? And what are some of the other cultural stigmas around certain acts of worship around menstruation? And then there is also a discussion on the most common reproductive health diseases. So there is a discussion on the common male reproductive health illnesses that are important for a high schooler, a male youth, to learn about, as many of them may pop up in high school or maybe in their early 20s. And so it's an important aspect to learn. This is a chart that's mentioned in this chapter that covers the most common male reproductive illnesses. Similarly, is female reproductive health. There is a discussion on vaginal discharge and some of the common concerns surrounding that, as well as a chart that covers common female medical reproductive illnesses. And then finally is the chapter review. So that is just a very, very brief overview of the reproductive health review chapter. But I would like to move actually into chapter 2 and the next chapters, as they require a lot more detail. So the second chapter that falls under reproductive health review is called Genderism. Genderism, or gender identity, it has been a very hot topic within the last few years. And just again to note, special acknowledgements to Dr. Wahid Jensen, who is a subject knowledge expert on Muslims who experience gender identity, who content edited this chapter. Now, this chapter actually opens with an introduction that defines the terms biological sex and gender, because these definitions socially and politically in today's times have really changed. So we start this chapter by first defining what these terms mean from an Islamic perspective. Biological sex refers to being male or female based on one's genitals, and it is biologically determined. One particular verse that highlights this is chapter 75, that states that Allah created and fashioned him in due proportion, and of him he made two sexes, the male and the female. There are also several other verses that are mentioned in this introduction. For example, that Allah creates everything in pairs of males and females, and that only these pairs can reproduce. As Allah mentions in chapter 53, verse 45, he created two mates, the male and female. There also is a verse that highlights that Allah is the one who chooses one's biological sex. This is in chapter 42, verse 49, that he grants females to whom he pleases and males to whom he pleases. Also, that males and females, we differ not just based on our reproductive in our anatomy, our reproductive organs in our anatomy, but we also have physiological, behavioral, and dispositional differences as well. As Allah mentions in Surah Al-Imran, verse 36, that the male is not like the female. Now, despite these differences, males and females are equal in the eyes of Allah. We both have the same potential to achieve his mercy and his reward, as Allah mentions in chapter 16, verse 97, whoever does righteousness, whether male or female, while a believer, and will surely cause him to live a good life, and we will surely give them reward in the hereafter, according to the best of what they used to do. Furthermore, there's verses that talk about how males and females are not to compete with each other, that we are to work alongside one another in joining good, in forbidding evil, in forming communities together, and that males and females are also to be allies to one another. So that is the intro that explains biological sex. And then there also is a brief discussion on the definition of gender. That gender refers to the norms, the behaviors, and the roles associated with being a woman, a man, a girl, or a boy. In Islam, this is termed urf, or societal conventions. Every society includes specific dress, interests, and mannerisms that are perceived as masculine and feminine in a given time and place. Now, Islam views gender not just as socially determined, but as being innate or fitri. This means that a male, generally speaking, innately gravitates towards mannerisms and interests that other males typically innately gravitate towards. Similarly for females, that a female, generally speaking, innately gravitates towards mannerisms and interests that other females innately gravitate towards. But the big question is, well, what if I don't? If a male does not innately gravitate towards mannerisms that other males have or interests that typically males have in their society, maybe they actually align more with certain mannerisms that females have or with interests that most females are interested in. Is he still considered a man? And in Islam, the answer is yes. He is still a man. Biology never is superseded by behavior, and of course, vice versa for a woman. As Brother Moveen Vaid, who is also a subject knowledge expert on the topic of genderism from the Islamic perspective, he said that behavior does not override biology when it comes to the ascription of gender. So again, this chapter opens with that introduction, and then it moves into the two sections that are covered in this chapter. The first section is the acknowledgement that Islam does recognize certain gender atypical individuals. And the second section goes into gender identity in today's time and how to combat and how to navigate through the movement. So let's first take a look at section 1. One type of individual that Islam recognizes as a gender atypical individual are those who have the medical conditions known as intersex. Intersex is an umbrella term that means abnormalities at one's hormonal, gonadal, genetic, or chromosomal level that impacts their biological sex and gender. For example, we can have a person who may be born with both male and female reproductive organs. Another example is a person who was born not XY for male and XX for female, but their chromosomes actually are XXY, or they are X, or they are just Y. Now, in most cases of intersex, the gender of the person is apparent and it's known. They may have some abnormalities and some medical conditions, but overall their gender is apparent and known. However, in some rare cases of intersex, the gender of the individual is not, and physicians may need to determine the gender or wait until that person hits puberty to determine how the body is developing, or even based on that person's own personal inclination of who they think they are. Now, for a person who is born intersex from the Islamic perspective, we believe that this is no fault of the person. This is a medical condition. They are born this way out of the will and the decree of Allah. Fiqh scholars have actually spoken in length about if a person is born intersex, what are their rights of inheritance? Where are they to stand in salah? What about their allowance when it comes to marriage? So there have been discussions amongst scholars regarding individuals who are born intersex. Islam also recognizes them as simply human beings. They are deserving of the same rights and respect as everybody else. It is impermissible and morally abhorrent to ridicule, tease, taunt, ostracize, or outcast a person who is born with this condition. And the second gender atypical individuals in Islam are those that would be deemed effeminate men and masculine women. Now, there's actually two categories of this. There is the congenital effeminate man or congenital effeminate woman. And this is a person who biologically is one gender. For example, you have a biological male, he is XY, but he unintentionally, not on purpose, he's not trying to imitate a woman, he just unintentionally manifests certain mannerisms or affectations of stereotypical women. Maybe he was born with a high-pitched voice, maybe he's unable to grow facial hair, maybe his hand gestures or the way that he walks may be deemed, the way feminine, maybe be deemed feminine. Maybe he has certain interests that most women tend to have, that men don't typically have. And we'd say the same thing about the congenital masculine woman. When it comes to the congenital type, Islamic jurists like An-Nawawi say that since the source of how they look or behave is they're not impersonating the opposite gender, it's actually outside of reasonable control, there's really no natural ability to change, that such a person is blameless. It's just who they are. They are still to define themselves as their biological sex, right? But there's no need for them to change their interests or what have you. Then you have the non-congenital. The non-congenital effeminate man or masculine woman is one who is deliberately and intentionally acting or looking like the opposite gender. And this is what is considered to be sinful in Islam. Now, there are a lot of reasons why a man or a woman may deliberately or may desire to be the opposite gender. Some studies have found that it could be that they feel alienated or distant by certain members of the same sex. They don't feel like they connect with them very well. They connect better with the opposite gender. This may even include a same-sex parent. They may have experienced certain traumas in their life that could impact their biological sense of who they are and their gender, having issues with body image. And especially something that we see in Western society is having a disinterest or a fear in identifying with cultural and social gender expressions. There are some cultures, like in Western society, that really do put restrictions on how a man is supposed to look and act and what his interests are, and how a woman is supposed to look and act and what her interests are. And if you don't fit in that box, then you must be in the other box, right? And then there are some activities that are mentioned in this section to kind of highlight this and get students to think about it. For example, a gender stereotype activity. And then there is the discussion how Islam actually challenges the notion of gender roles. That Islam as a rule, it's not overly prescriptive on what counts as what is masculine and what is feminine. For example, there are many examples in the Sirah of Sahaba, and there's a chart here that gives many examples of different Sahaba behaving in ways that actually go against societal gender norms. We have discussions about men who would cry profusely, even the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We have examples of women fighting in battle. We have examples of the Prophet alaihi wasallam participating in domestic chores. We have examples of Sahaba men who were excused from fighting in battle because they simply weren't good with swordsmanship. And so we see how Islam actually challenged gender norms. And that being said, Islam has placed particular boundaries that you can control in order to align with your gender. Like you cannot dress like the opposite gender, intergender interactions are to remain being with those of the same gender, except if they're mahram to you. That men cannot wear silk or gold, but otherwise the rest is really up to you based on your preferences and your culture. For example, in some societies, what is deemed feminine, it may not be in others. So in this way, Islam is actually a lot more liberating than strict cultural views and modern interpretations of gender norms. And then section 2 gets into understanding gender identity in our society today. This chapter or this section, it opens up with defining the medical condition called gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is a medical condition where a person may feel a distress over a mismatch between what their gender is and their sex assigned at birth. For example, they may feel, I was born a male, but I feel like I should be a woman, or vice versa. Now, reasons why a person may develop gender dysphoria includes perhaps the way that they were raised, maybe growing up in a family where the father had very high expectations on what he wanted his sons to be like or act like, and same with a daughter. Certain life circumstances, failure to identify with one society's gender stereotypes. Now, in today's time, we are seeing certain ideologies that promote the notion that if you have gender identity, then perhaps you were born in the wrong body. And the most humane and life-saving option for you is to go ahead and identify with whatever gender you choose to identify as. And this has now been termed gender identity. There are now even discussions about, well, what if a child even develops gender dysphoria, that before they hit puberty, they should be given the option to transition to the gender that they want. And there is a box that explains how the transition process works for children, that they are given puberty blockers before they hit puberty to prevent them from going through puberty. And then they are given hormones that a biological female would be given testosterone so that she could grow facial hair, that she could get a deeper voice. A biological male would be given estrogen, so that way he would lose facial hair, that he wouldn't develop that much muscle. And then there's also, of course, as they get older, is the option to completely transition surgically, such as removing body parts. There rarely is a discussion on the side effects and the harms that can come with these types of transitioning process, especially with steroid hormones, one of which is the risk of permanent infertility, along with other risks of cancer and high blood pressure, heart attack, stroke, and liver damage that can occur when one is being given the hormone that their body is not naturally inclined to receiving a lot of. Now, the gender identity movement has led to many controversial policy changes in the last few years. The push for gender-neutral bathrooms, a change in the use of pronouns, allowing trans females to play in women's sports and vice versa. There's even discussions on parental abuse if they force their child to transition, or even if a parent opposes their child wanting to transition. So we're seeing a lot of effects that this movement has made in the last few years. And one may wonder, well, is it possible for a person to overcome gender dysphoria? As certain movements in today's time, they promote the notion that the most life-saving option for a person with gender dysphoria is to let them be the gender that they want. But gender dysphoria is a mental disorder. Influences of experiences, emotional attachment, traumas, individual perceptions play a very strong role in this disorder. So rather than encouraging transition, giving such individuals an opportunity to seek help from a mental health professional that encourage them to work through their feelings, to find ways to accept their biological sex, that maybe this may help them to overcome with it, or at least live with it in peace, instead of constantly pushing to transition. Now, there are some adults in today's time who did transition, and they felt pressured when they were younger to transition, and they're now going public with stories of trauma and anxiety and malpractice by medical practitioners and therapists, that they felt that they were forced to transition when it wasn't something that in the end was something that they felt was right for them. And then finally is the topic of, well, what is the Islamic view on gender identity? In Islam, changing one's gender from one's biological sex is prohibited, right? Furthermore, Islam does not permit supporting this movement. Living in a secular society, we as Muslims are to be tolerant. This means that we don't mistreat or harm others because of the lifestyle that they choose. But at the same time, tolerance should not jeopardize our moral principles, our Islamic moral principles. It is your right as a Muslim to say, I don't support the gender identity movement, I don't endorse it, and you have the right to have the beliefs that you want. And it's important that we teach Muslim youth to have that confidence to be respectful and tolerant of others, while at the same time demand that the same thing occurs for them. They also be given that same tolerance back. Then, of course, is the question of a Muslim themselves saying, I think I may have gender dysphoria. Maybe there's certain things that I've gone through in my life, or maybe based on the society that we live in, is I feel like I'm in the wrong body, or I feel that I want to be, or I desire to be the opposite gender. How can we seek, or how can such a person seek help within our Muslim community? Now, there are Muslims definitely who struggle with gender dysphoria, and they struggle to accept their biological sex. Some might even contemplate transitioning as a path to healing. So if you or someone you know may be dealing with gender dysphoria, it's important to seek out Muslim-based social support, talk to a Muslim-based mental health counselor that can help you work through your feelings, find peace and understanding with the biological sex you were created with, help one to understand perhaps the origin of why one may feel and may develop gender dysphoria. And there are several resources that are shared in this chapter, as well as in the back of the book. And just to also highlight, is as us for a Muslim community, we are to be compassionate of all Muslims who may be struggling with an array of tests. If a Muslim is seeking help and guidance with gender dysphoria, the community is to not shame them or criminalize them. Such individuals are to be welcomed in our masjid, treated as brothers and sisters when they are struggling, but they're not moving to change Islam. The exception is if a Muslim tries to justify or legitimize a sinful act. And of course, in that case, the community is to be protected. But this is a brief overview on genderism from an Islamic perspective, and closing with the chapter review. Any questions or comments on this chapter? All right, with that, we'll go ahead and move on. So the last three chapters of level 3 fall under the sexual health unit. The sexual health unit, it's all about the topic of sexuality. And the first chapter is called Sexual Desire and Intimacy. It includes the following 4 sections. Section 1 is on the influences of sexual desire. Section 2 is on taking control of sexual feelings. Section 3 is on waiting until marriage, the modern day jihad. And Section 4 is on intimacy in a marriage. Now, Section 1 is about influences of sexual desire. Level 2 discuss sexual desire as one of the changes of puberty. This chapter gets into much more detail on sexual desire, particularly on what influences a person's sexual desire. One example that's talked about is biology, that our hormones influence our sex drive. For some people, they may biologically have or be born with the development of a high sex drive. They may think about it all the time. They may want to engage in sex frequently. They may find all types of people attractive. Now, a person who may be born with a high sex drive, meaning that it becomes apparent after puberty, or they have periods in their life where their sex drive is very high, this is not an excuse to engage in unlawful sexual acts. It is simply meant to be a test. To stay within the confines of Islam, take extra precautions. Some preventive measures are avoidance of entertainment that may bring about uncontrolled sexual desire, avoidance of drugs and substances that may increase one's sex drive, encouragement to get married if one is ready and able to do so, the encouragement to regularly curb feelings through acts of the sunnah like fasting and others that we'll talk about. Another influence biologically is the opposite, that a person may be born once they hit puberty with a low or no sex drive. They may have no interest in it at all. They may choose to be in a marital relationship, but more of one of companionship than intimacy, or maybe they choose to not get married at all. Of course, when it comes to either a high or a low sex drive, it's important that one talk to their doctor to make sure there's no other underlying medical conditions going on. A second influence is upbringing. Upbringing or family views on sex can really influence one's sexual desire. One example is if some families or cultures think that sexual desires are bad, shameful, or sinful, this can lead a person to develop feelings called sexual guilt, where they feel a fear of being judged or of even thinking about or even desire sexual activity. And this is a feeling that can actually remain with them even when they're married, and it can lead to intimacy issues when one is married. Researcher Dr. Sobia Ali Faisal, she stated that negative sexual self-judgment can lead to unhealthy relationships and marriages as one gets older. And there's an activity that talks a little bit about that, about sex education in the household, on the importance of teaching youth about sex education, not just in school, but also at home, that parents who hold negative views towards sexual feelings, they may also be less likely to provide their children with sex education. As Dr. Sobia Ali Faisal's found, her study found that the least likely source of sex education for Muslim youth is their own parents. Other aspects of upbringing may be trauma or abuse. They may influence a person's feelings towards sex. It may influence who a person is sexually attracted to, such as a person of the same sex or opposite sex. That trauma or abuse may lead to hypersexuality or no sexuality at all. Talking with a mental health professional can help one to understand why they may have certain sexual feelings and how they can learn to resolve them or live with them in peace. A third influence is societal influence. Living in a society like Western society that often promotes sex publicly may lead individuals in that society to become more hypersexualized, may become desensitized from certain sexual acts that morally may be abhorrent or impermissible, such as premarital relations, same-sex relations, adultery, or other sexual acts. Also, outward sexual expression in certain societies can lead others to develop heightened sexual desire. In contrast, societies that actually regulate nudity or that limit sexual expression in public, like public displays of affection, they may lead to less sex-driven people. So society can definitely have an influence. And a final influence, and there's many others, but these are the four that are mentioned in this section, is one's personal beliefs. Belief can really influence the way a person views sexual desires. Islam actually has a very positive view on intimacy in a marriage. It considers it to be a form of worship and rewardable, as it's narrated by Abu Dhar that the Prophet ﷺ said that having relations with one's wife is a charity. And they said, "O Messenger of Allah, if one of us fulfills his desire, is there a reward in that?" And he, alayhi salam, he said, "Do you not see that if he does it in a haram way, he would have the burden of sin? But if he does it in the halal way, he will have a reward for that." This is in Muslim. Now, not all religions and belief systems look at intimacy in a marriage with such positivity. There are some religions that consider when you choose your personal desires over your devotion to God, that this is a sign of irreligiosity. There are some religions that also promote celibacy or making a vow to never engage in sexual desire. This is not a concept in Islam at all. There were some Sahaba that actually heard about celibacy from the people of the book, and they thought, well, this act may bring you closer to Allah, or bring you closer to righteousness. And with that, Allah revealed the following verse in the Quran. This is in chapter 5, verse 87, that, "O you who believe, make not unlawful the tayyibat, all that is good with deeds, beliefs, and persons, which Allah has made lawful to you. And transgress not, verily Allah does not like the transgressors." That in this verse, Allah is saying, don't make haram what Allah has made halal for you. In other words, there is a wisdom behind halal outlets. They provide a balance to your desires. We notice that when cultures or certain belief systems take away permissible outlets for natural desires, this inevitably leads to a release in inappropriate and harmful outlets, such as sexual promiscuity or sexual violence within certain types of belief systems. Now, while Islam does have a very positive view, it doesn't mean that we can just fulfill it whenever and however we want to. This is a positivity within the boundary of fulfilling it in a marriage and within certain sexual acts. But until then, we are commanded by Allah to abstain from engaging in sexual acts. Now, the remaining sections kind of look at those responsibilities on controlling one's sexual feelings until marriage. The second section talks about how to take control of sexual feelings. Now, incidents of Muslim youth dating and engaging in sexual acts has definitely been on the rise in the last few years. A 2001 study by the Family and Youth Institute, based on the individuals that participated in their study, found that 54% of American Muslim college students in their study have engaged in premarital relations. And then a more recent study in 2014 by Dr. Sobia Ali Faisal, she found that of the individuals she surveyed that were Canadian and American Muslims between the ages of 17 and 35, that 67% of the participants in her study engaged in premarital relations. And of those who didn't, 50% have considered it. Now, sexual desire, even though it is natural and it's a normal feeling, it is still a test from Allah. We are responsible to learn how to channel it appropriately. And by doing so, we can lose its power to really control us. So some examples are preventative measures. Islam is a preventative faith. It doesn't just hand out rulings of right and wrong and leave you to figure it out. Allah actually provides us with preventative measures. There are Islamic communal mannerisms that are ordained around sexual desires to help us regulate it. So some examples that are talked about in this section are lowering the gaze, maintaining modesty, regulating gender interactions. There's also a box that talks about men and women and being friends, and research showing how that's essentially impossible, that it can lead to all types of issues and problems, and mismatched feelings and goals. Another way is action measures. Action measures is about talking about certain acts from the Sunnah that come with controlling sexual feelings. So, for example, is fasting regularly. As the Prophet ﷺ says, "O young men, whoever among you can afford it, let him get married, for it helps him to lower his gaze and protect his chastity. And whoever cannot do it, let him fast, for it will be a protection for him." There's also an activity that asks youth to think about, well, what are other measures, active measures that one can take, such as making dua to Allah, seeking refuge from shaitan, holding firm to our daily salah, praying tahajjud, getting involved in our community, being active, volunteering, attending halaqas, joining a sports team, trying new things like new hobbies, spending time with friends. And there even is the option of consider getting married early if one is really struggling with it. Now, this section also includes a common question by youth is, well, what about the action measure of self-stimulation or masturbation? Is this something that is permissible in Islam if it is a means to control sexual desire? Now, the section here, it does go into the different opinions when it comes to masturbation, but the main one being that masturbation is impermissible, with the exception that if it is choosing between the lesser of two evils, such as one is in a situation of premarital sex versus masturbation, then in that case, that it is the lesser of two evils. It also goes into some things to think about when it comes to masturbation, as this is something which is also a common occurrence amongst youth, is that masturbation should not be the means of controlling desire. Controlling your desire, avoiding what brings it out, fasting regularly, actively looking to get married when you're ready, these are good action measures that come with controlling desire. Also is to teach youth about how masturbation can lead to addiction. A person who has lost control of this desire may start to masturbate obsessively. It's not a means of controlling sexual desire. It's actually increasing one's sexual desire. They may skip daily activities. They may cancel plans with their family, important events, because they are addicted to masturbation. And this is also something that can last into a marriage and impact the intimacy in a relationship. For others, they may actually prefer the addiction to even getting married at all. So these are very extreme examples, but it's important for youth to understand the risks that come with it. And of course, is when it comes to masturbation and pornography. So there is a box that talks about pornography. This is a study that was done by the Family and Youth Institute and Young Muslim Organization, where they found, based on the participants in their study, that 59% of Muslim youth between the ages of 16 and 22 view pornography, and that 37% admitted to doing so daily. So this talks a little bit about the reasons why they engage in it, that they may struggle with it, and some resources are also shared to help one who may be really struggling with whether it's an addiction or struggling to quit. The other action measure is to remember the reward of chastity. Chastity is a virtuous trait, a person choosing to avoid sexual acts and, dating or romantic relationships until marriage, that this may be something that can be very difficult in today's time. But if you remember the reward of chastity, that inshallah, that would be a great motivation and factor. There also is an activity that talks about that the reminder that perhaps, this is something in which may not be a difficult test for you, but there may be peers around you who really struggle with the test of sexual feelings, and they may engage, or you may hear a lot of gossip about so-and-so is dating, or so-and-so is acting like this, or, with this person, that one should be very mindful of this type of gossip, or even, the risk of slandering another person based on, such a severe accusation. And the story about the slander of Aisha radiallahu anha is used to reflect that. Section 3 goes into waiting until marriage, the modern day jihad. This goes into the question that a lot of youth may have, which is, well, I want to be in a relationship now. I'm exposed to it. I see it all the time. I see people dating in school all the time, or my peers, or it's in movies and books and social media that I see, and it increases that desire. And research has found that almost all Americans have premarital sex before marriage. That a research study found that by the age of 20, and this is non-Muslims, that 75% of Americans engage in premarital relations, and by the time they reach 44, it's 95%. So we live in a society where premarital relations is the norm, and it can be very difficult for one who is not, or choosing not to for religious reasons, to really struggle with that. So this section goes into, and I know there's a lot here on this slide, but this is just for you to see it, that a chart here shows the difference between dating and Islamic courtship. That when it comes to the intention behind why one dates, that the intention between each person may be different. They may be doing it to find a partner to get married to. They may be doing it to fulfill sexual feelings. Maybe they're doing it because they feel lonely. Whereas in Islamic courtship, the intention is that you're interacting with this person for the purpose of marriage. A second comparison is on how one gets to know each other. That when it comes to dating, they may or may not discuss certain important topics like religion, children, finances. Plus, their parents may not typically be involved in the conversation until they, get very serious in the relationship. So the couple is kind of left without any guidance or protection in the beginning stages of dating. Whereas in Islamic courtship, a wali must be involved, and the focus of the discussion that they should be having to determine if they're compatible is talking about finances, education, parenting styles, career, conflict resolution, about faith and religion, physicality as well. Conventional dating, there's no boundaries, whereas Islamically it's impermissible. Responsibility when it comes to conventional dating, the more that two people date, the more committed they are, but within that commitment, there's no expectation that you are responsible for the other person. So, they may live separately or together, have separate finances. If a child is born, how involved they are may vary depending on the commitment of the relationship. Whereas in Islamic courtship, when it comes to meeting someone for the purpose of marriage, each person is permissible to talk with other suitors. But once married, as both a husband and a wife, there are certain types of Islamic rights and responsibilities that they each are to fulfill to the other. And then finally is when it comes to ending the relationship, despite how much they may share physically, emotionally, financially, when it comes to dating, if they decide to break up, it's a very easy breakup, and it may lead, to trust issues in future relationships. For other couples, if they've been together for a long time, they may decide to continue to stay with each other, just because of how much they've invested emotionally. Whereas in Islamic courtship, if two people are talking and they're not interested anymore, they could break off the engagement. While that may cause some emotional difficulty, as that's normal, it's easier to kind of move on and find someone else to learn from that experience, and to find someone else and to ask different questions to determine compatibility. Now, as an outsider looking in, conventional dating appears really fun and exciting. But when we analyze it deeply, like in this chart, we realize that dating has a lot of drawbacks. It's not really a reliable way at all to seek a companion. It makes it difficult to stay committed to one person. It can even be dangerous. The guidelines of Islamic courtship, they are set in place not to restrict you and make your life difficult, but they're there to really find the best person for you, inshallah. They enable rational thinking, assured commitment, and protection in your relationship. So when we talk about Muslims who may be dating, this gives them idea of, how to really look at that and how to rely on Islamic courtship. And then, of course, is for our youth to remember that, yeah, you may see people dating and engaging in premarital relations all the time, but when you are not at that point of looking for a spouse right now, take advantage of your youthful age. You're so much more than just a person who's looking for someone to love or get married to. Enjoy this time in your life. You have the freedom to volunteer, work, study, teach, be with your friends, travel. So enjoy that time. There also is discussions on, well, what if I'm already in a relationship? What if I'm already dating someone who's Muslim or someone who's non-Muslim? And, how do I handle that situation? So there is some advice that's offered in this section. There's also a podcast recommendation on breaking off a relationship and how to do so from an Islamic perspective. This section also talks about the risks of premarital relations. It goes into the physical risks like STDs and unintended pregnancy, the mental risks, such as the impact of self-worth when one moves from one person to the other. Thomas More, who's the author of Soul of Sex, he said that we have a habit of talking about sex as merely physical, and yet nothing has more soul. Even if sex is loveless, empty, or manipulative, Still, it has strong repercussions in the soul, and bad sexual experiences leave a lasting, haunting impression. Spiritual risks are also talked about, such as that this is sinful to engage in on sexual acts outside of marriage. There are some youth who think, okay, well, I'm dating someone, I'm engaging in sexual acts, but I'm not having sexual intercourse. So it's important to highlight to them that all sexual acts, right? Kissing, touching, even being alone with a non-mahram, this is impermissible in Islam, and it comes with spiritual risks. And it's important to be aware of them and to protect yourself. And then the other final risk is on the social risk, that even if one does not engage in premarital relations or in dating before marriage or what have you, that when we live in a society that has made it a norm, it is going to impact everybody. A cascade of immoral events have occurred as a result of premarital sex being rampant and open and accepted. It has led to undermining the institution of marriage, children being born without a family unit. We're seeing more people cohabiting, open acceptance of all forms of sexualities, a rise in sexual promiscuity, elective abortion, sexual violence, sexual diseases. And it's for these reasons and many more why we see the Islamic ruling about the punishment that comes with premarital relations, that the public punishment, which only is into effect in a Sharia-guided government, not to be taken in anyone's own hands, but it's there to protect the society. And so there is a box that talks about the punishment for zina within the Sharia penal code as well. And then finally is Section 4. This section actually talks about fulfilling sexual desires in a marriage. It's important that we teach our youth the rulings and the rights and how to actually engage in intimacy when married, before they get married, as a means of prevention, as a means of kind of preparation. This opens up with talking about that they are your garments and you are their garments. This beautifully depicts how intimacy is not just this physical act in an Islamic marriage, but it meant to bring spouses together emotionally and spiritually. This section talks about how the Prophet ﷺ would build romance in his marriage, the romantic words he would use when he would speak to his wives, that he would spend quality time with them. For example, when he would race with Aisha radiallahu anha, when he would give gifts, such as giving gifts to friends of Khadija or relatives of Khadija long after she passed away, the acts of service that he would give, that he would help in the home, that he would engage in certain household duties, and physical touch, that the Prophet ﷺ, that even while, a wife was menstruating, for example, and she would drink from a cup, that he would drink from the same spot, or if she would eat from a part of the bone of meat, that he would eat from the same part, that those were aspects of love. Of course, another example is Aisha leaning on the Prophet ﷺ on the day of Eid when they watched the Abyssinians doing a performance. So we see these acts of romance, and that this is permissible and allowed and encouraged, even from the Sunnah, to engage in these acts of romance with one spouse. Of course, we see these when we walk about in Western society. We see people engaging in these acts in public, or we see it on social media. But these are really private moments between a couple, and they do build love, and they do actually increase the sexual desire. And then, of course, is the actual sexual etiquette. And I've chosen to use the following hadith to best explain this to youth, which is the story about Jabir radiallahu anhu, a young companion of the Prophet ﷺ, recently married, and he was racing to visit his wife after an expedition. And the Prophet ﷺ, he offers him some advice. He says, Jabir, the Prophet ﷺ said, so when we are about to enter the city, the Prophet ﷺ said, slow down and enter at night, so that she who has not combed may comb her hair, she who has not shaved may shave her private area. And then later on, it talks about gentleness and being wise. So this talks a little bit about three main aspects of sexual etiquette. Is number one, looking presentable for each other, looking nice. We talked about certain hygienic practices that we are to engage in back in level 2, as well as early in the reproductive health review chapter here. That one is to be gentle, that one is to engage in acts of intimacy or romance before the actual act of intercourse, and to be wise, to know some of the Islamic rulings, such as making dua before intimacy is a sunnah, knowing the prohibited times of intimacy, such as during menstruation, when one is fasting, when one is in a state of ihram, to know the prohibited acts of intimacy, which is anal intercourse, understanding how to remove sexual impurity, talking about ghusl, and of course is the importance of keeping matters of intimacy private between the couple. Of course, unless one has a medical concern or a safety concern or counseling, that's different, but just general conversation. And of course, is being sexually responsible, that if a child results from the intimate act, that they are to take responsibility for that outcome and support each other. And then we have, of course, the chapter review. Any questions or comments on this chapter before we move on?
Dr. Jazakumullah kul khair. We do have one question here from Sister Naziha. She's asking regarding separating the male and female students in this level. Would you recommend that? Also, she's asking regarding the teacher. Is it preferable, of course, to have a male teacher teach the male and vice versa?
Jazakallah khair for your question. So we do have a teacher's manual that's going to be coming out for every single level. And for this particular level, the recommendation is that you do separate by gender when teaching this level, and that you also have a same gender teacher to teach this level as well, to provide the utmost amount of comfort and safety for the students. Okay, if there aren't any questions, I'm going to move on to, we have 2 more chapters left. Chapter 4 is on sexual attraction. This chapter is also kind of aligns with gender identity because it falls under the LGBTQ movement of same-sex attraction. Just to highlight as well, this chapter has also been content edited by Dr. Wahid Jensen. May Allah reward him tremendously for his efforts in helping me with this chapter. This chapter includes 3 sections. First is on sexual attraction and identity. Section 2 is on the Islamic understanding of same-sex acts. And finally, 3 is the Islamic tolerance towards sexual identities and what exactly that means. So section 1 begins talking about that in today's time, some societies, they believe that the gender of the person that you are attracted to becomes your identity. Islam, however, does not recognize identities based on sexual attraction. In Islam, who you find sexually attractive is a feeling. And feelings are never forbidden or forbidden or punishable in Islam. But when it comes to acting on our sexual feelings, the only sexual acts that are permissible in Islam are those between a man and a woman who are married and engaging in sexual acts that are permissible under the Sharia. To deliberately do otherwise is sinful in Islam. For sexual acts to go unlimited and unregulated, like premarital relations, extramarital relations, same-sex relations, of course, sexual violence, this can lead to profound and adverse harms on both the individuals involved as well as the society. It's why the Sharia guides us on what desires we can act on and which ones we need to control for the greater good of us in society. As Allah mentions in chapter 23, verse 71, that if truth were contingent upon the desires of people, then all the heavens and the earth would become corrupt. So we do not view sexual attraction as an identity. Now, a major dilemma for youth, Muslim youth in today's time, is the way that Islam separates desires from actions, from identity, but certain movements, such as the LGBTQ movement, combine these. They combine desires, actions, and identity. This is represented here. This is a graphic that was made by Yaqeen Institute that highlights this. Now, these are polar opposites between Islam and between certain movements in today's time that has led to a lot of challenges that Muslim youth are facing around their non-Muslim peers and around societal views, because we hold polar opposite views. The remaining 2 sections of this chapter discuss it. So the second section, section 2, gets into the proof. What is the Islamic understanding of same-sex acts? Now, we're not going to be able to go into the entire story of Lut alayhi salam, but just so you're aware, this section does. It's going to go into the entire story of Lut alayhi salam, and there's a few things that I want to highlight for you. Some things to point out is that while the people of Lut alayhi salam, the people of Saddam committed many sins, there was one sin that was unique to them as a society, and that was the engagement of same-sex acts that they would commit consensually with each other and also by force, but particularly with people who would visit the city. And this act has been termed sodomy, and it's named after the city of Saddam, where these people were the first as a community to normalize the sin publicly and as a community. And there are some verses here that highlight that. Now, other important points about the story is, number one, the Prophet Lut alayhi salam, he was not calling his people to identify with a particular sexual identity, but he also wasn't dismissing their feelings. He was saying that regardless of what you feel, regardless of your desires, strive to connect your actions to what Allah has deemed appropriate and permissible. Act on what is permissible and avoid what is impermissible. He was calling his people to Tawheed, to the oneness of Allah, and to following the rulings of Allah. As Abdullah ibn Omar, he narrates that the Prophet ﷺ said that none of you have faith until his desires comply with what I have brought. The second is that same-sex acts are explicitly prohibited based on the story of Lut alayhi salam. Now, there are some Muslims who strive to change the religion of Allah and make allowances for homosexuality and say, Islam actually allows homosexuality, and they change the story of Lut alayhi salam. And one way in which they do that is they say that the people of Saddam, they were punished for rape. And yes, they did commit sexual violence, but the people of Saddam, they were called out for committing a sin that no other community normalized. And that wasn't sexual violence. That wasn't unique to them as a society, albeit it is wrong and impermissible in Islam. But the act that they were called out for was sodomy. As Allah mentions in chapter 7, verse 80-81, do you commit such immorality as no one has preceded you with from among the worlds? The prohibition of same-sex acts is unanimously agreed upon by the scholars and without any difference of opinion. And the third is that even if one does not engage in the act themselves, supporting it and encouraging it is also prohibited. And this is based on the wife of Lut alayhi salam also receiving the punishment. This section then goes on to, well, what if I'm Muslim and I struggle with same-sex feelings? Now, the society that we live in and other societies today, they promote the belief that sexuality is an identity. And so if you have same-sex attraction, then you should identify as that. You should label yourself as gay or homosexual, embrace that identity, be true to yourself. And if your religion doesn't support that and says your identity is wrong, then there's a problem with that religion. This is the danger that comes with when we conflate identity with feelings. So when it comes to the Islamic perspective, if a Muslim is experiencing or feeling attraction to the same gender, rather than using terms like, I identify as gay, don't call it an identity. Refer to it simply as a feeling, because that's exactly what it is. Define it as, this is a test of sexual desires. This implies a set of feelings and not a way of life. It also helps to keep one's desire in proper perspective and control. Furthermore, it helps to maintain that their ultimate identity is being a servant of Allah. Brother Mobeen Vaid, he says here that as Muslims, there's no umbrella identity that is more critical in our lives than being Muslim. Being Muslim gives us the identity. It tells us how to view the world, how to live morally. Our other identities as parents, children, siblings, students, teachers, etc., are conditioned and qualified by the identity of Islam and not the other way around. Finally is advice for Muslims who may be dealing with same-sex attraction. And this section was almost entirely facilitated by Dr. Wahid Jensen. And so some advice that he offers is, firstly, that when someone may say to an imam or a teacher, I'm struggling with same-sex feelings, to say something like, just get over it, they really may fail to understand the origin of the feeling. That for people with same-sex attraction, it may be a biological feeling. Maybe they have a very high sex drive. For others, it may be social, because I come from a LGBTQ promoted society, that's where the influence is. But most research theories have found that same-sex attraction is psychological, that maybe there's something that they experienced or went through in their life that may have led to them developing same-sex attraction. There is a support group for Muslims who struggle with same-sex attraction called Straight Struggle. And they conducted a survey asking different questions about those individuals who are Muslim and struggle with same-sex attraction. And one of the responses that one of the individuals said was that realized that same-sex attraction are usually surface manifestations of deeper emotional and psychological issues. And so because of that, Dr. Wahid Jensen, he recommends that seeking help from a Muslim-based mental health professional may help to understand the origin of where these feelings come from, learning to maybe not even overcoming them, perhaps overcoming them, but if one still struggles with it their whole life, then learning to live with it in peace. Joining Muslim-based support groups can also help. Educating oneself and continuing to educate oneself on the Muslim narrative of same-sex attraction. Oftentimes, the LGBTQ narrative is presented as the only source of guidance for those dealing with same-sex attraction, and Muslims may lean towards the LGBTQ community on understanding it, and LGBTQ usually will come to them with open arms and acceptance. So it's important that the Muslim narrative be taught and understood as well, especially in our Islamic schools. Avoiding entertainment that has an LGBTQ agenda. There's a lot of that in today's time. Invest in physical growth and continue to always maintain a spiritual connection with Allah. If you are struggling with a test from Allah, but you are not acting on that test, inshallah, you are being, inshallah, heavily rewarded for your ability to abide by the ruling of Allah over one's own desires. And then finally, section 3 is on living in a society that promotes sexual identities and how we are to be tolerant and what our restrictions of tolerance are. According to a 2022 Gallup poll, only 7% of US adults identify as something other than straight or heterosexual. So it's a very small subset of the population that identifies as LGBTQ, about 7%. Yet, we find that most Americans support LGBTQ. This is a 2021 Gallup poll study that found that over 70% of Americans, despite that only 7% identify as LGBTQ, are supportive of the LGBTQ movement. And subhanAllah, it also includes Muslims as well. A 2017 Pew Research study found that 52%, that almost half of Muslims, particularly those in that younger Muslim age bracket, support homosexuality. Now, LGBTQ has really come a long way in these last few years on pushing for the greater community to support them. They are a very small percentage of the community. They only make up 7%. But by educating the entire community or pushing the entire community to learn about LGBTQ, to make their companies more inclusive to them, this leads to not just support, but then it starts to lead to policy changes. And this is exactly what we're seeing in today's time. They have worked very hard to foster support, and widespread promotion and acceptance has now occurred. Again, that support group by the Muslims who struggle with same-sex attraction, one of them said that know that the LGBTQ narrative in society is very strong. And most young people today have been thoroughly indoctrinated into that perspective through ceaseless, overt, and subliminal messaging. So this is a Muslim who is personally struggling with same-sex attraction is saying this to Muslim youth that, that you in particular as youth are being heavily promoted or heavily indoctrinated into promoting and supporting this. And we are seeing that it is working. Over 50% of Muslims support homosexuality. In spite of this rising popularity, Islamic's ethical values do not change with time, place, or the laws of a particular country, right? But it has definitely brought about a lot of challenges for Muslim youth in today's time. Youth feel that, well, if I don't support it, then I may be labeled as homophobic or discriminatory. People may not want to be my friend. I'm worried that I might lose my scholarship, or, I feel very alone and very isolated. Encouraging our youth to stand tall and be proud that Allah has blessed them with understanding of moral wisdom, especially when it comes to sexual desires, is something that they should feel confident in, rather than feeling a sense of embarrassment or shame or not wanting other people to know. You have the truth and you have been guided. Many in our society are actually really struggling. Many in the greater society, non-Muslim society, they're struggling with what is morally right and wrong. And there are several people who inwardly disagree with homosexuality and the LGBTQ movement, but they don't speak up. They support it out of social pressure. So for Muslims to respectfully say, I do not agree with this movement, I do not support it, but I'm respectful and tolerant of all other people, this is something in which we should encourage our youth to feel that sense of confidence. If you have been blessed to learn the wisdom behind Allah's rulings, have a responsibility to not only accept it, but respectfully share that with others. Now, how exactly is tolerance to be portrayed by Muslims living in a society that promotes sexual identities? 3 ways is, number 1, we give respect to all human beings. The worst sin is to worship other than Allah. And even of those who worshipped multiple gods or associated partners with Allah during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, they were still respectful to them. One example is Asma bin Abi Bakr radiallahu anha, where the Prophet ﷺ, she said to the Prophet ﷺ that my mother is coming to visit me. She's a pagan. Should I be kind to her? And she's going to give me gifts. Should I accept them? Should I treat her well? And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, greet and treat your mother well. That despite what she believes, we, treat other people respectfully. So the same thing when we're interacting with those who may identify as gay, we treat them with the same kindness and respects. And Lut alayhi salam, he said in his dawah, this is in chapter 26, verses 168, that indeed I am toward your deed of those who detest it. He separated the sin from the person. At the same time, you also are deserving of respect and tolerance of your beliefs. You may feel at times that you're being asked to do more than just tolerate, but to accept and support or risk being socially ostracized, right? You may become bullied or rejected for stating you simply support homosexual acts, that supporting homosexual acts are against your religious beliefs. Stating that there is nothing wrong with saying that. You have the full constitutional right to say that you don't want to participate or it's not something that you agree with if you're ever put in that position where you feel like you have to do more than just tolerate. You have to support or risk being socially ostracized. And we are to encourage politically and even socially in our communities for that right. The second is that we can come together for the sake of human rights. Now, especially when we're seeing in today's time with the pro-Palestinian movement, we're seeing a lot of people who identify as gay supporting the pro-Palestinian movement. And that is because it's not because they support Islam, right? It's because they're witnessing an injustice and they're speaking out about that issue. There's nothing wrong with accepting support from others, regardless of their belief or sexual identity, because we're coming together for the sake of human rights. And Muslims can do the same thing as well for others who are not Muslim when it comes to the people being targeted or abused. And we can come together for that sake of human rights. And then finally is 3, is to be confident in your tolerance. Living in a multi-faith society, we are to respect our differences as well as agree on a certain set of core commitments in order to live together. One of that is that one person's beliefs can't be impinged on another. It is your right to say you morally disagree with same-sex acts, that you don't support it, you don't endorse it, you're not going to participate in Pride Month activities, even if they're held at your school. This issue for us is not a matter of social justice. This issue is an issue of morality of behavior. Protect yourself from the pressure of support. Stay on the side of always being tolerant and respectful, but also know that if you feel like you are being prevented from practicing your faith, there are some resources available that you can contact, one of which is CARE, and there's some resources shared at the end of this chapter as well as in the back of the book. Any questions or comments before we move on to our final chapter? Okay, we'll go ahead and move on. Our final chapter in level 5 is on sexual violence. The sections that are included in this chapter is number 1, understanding consent. Section 2 talks about different types of sexual violence. Section 3 goes into the Islamic rulings on sexual violence. And finally, section 4 is on advocating for survivors. Now, this will be highlighted in the teacher's manual. It's also mentioned in the student textbook that this topic, this chapter, is a very sensitive topic for students and educators, especially when it's being taught in a public setting. So one is to ask students if you consider or if you're interested in an alternative or safe option to learn this in a private setting, or you want to discuss this with the school counselor versus, in an open classroom, then we give our youth and our students the opportunity and the ability to do so. There are other options and alternative learning environments for this particular chapter that one may want to share with their students and talk about it with their school administration, but something to just keep in mind. Section 1 begins with first defining consent. Consent is permission for something to happen or an agreement to do something, like if a friend says, "Can I borrow your phone?" right? And waiting for you to say yes or no. Consent can also include permission to be physical, like, "Can I give you a hug?" or even being alone with someone. When someone asks consent or vice versa, this is a sign of being respectful of another person, rather than taking, forcing, doing whatever you want. They understand you have boundaries and you have the right to agree or disagree. Furthermore is when they accept your choice to say no and change your mind later on. To be forced to do something that makes you uncomfortable is not consent. It is a violation of one's personal boundaries. And this box shows some examples about what is not consent, such as being silent, if a person didn't get a chance to say no, if the person never resisted, what a person wears, if two people are in a relationship, whether they're in a marital relationship or a premarital relationship. Perhaps they've given consent in the past, but now they've changed their mind, or if they are threatened or coerced to say yes. Also, consent is never possible when you have a child, that a child does not know what they are consenting to. Also, as a person who is sleeping or under the influence of substances or unconscious, that also consent can also not be given. Now, it's important that we teach our youth to develop the skills on how to say no, right? Discussions on assertiveness are discussed in this section. Also, some tips on how to say no. And this is not just within a sexual situation, but this is just consent in general. Just knowing and how to stand up for yourself, how to say no. And then it goes into that if you do not give consent, but a person does sexual activities anyway, so if it's regarding a sexual activity that one did not consent to do, that is sexual violence. Sexual violence is when a person or a group of people force somebody to engage in a sexual act. And the rest of the chapter then goes into topics and types of sexual violence. So section 2 talks about different types of sexual violence. Sexual violence can happen to anyone, regardless of their age, their gender, their religious beliefs, their ethnicity, how they look, how they dress. It is most commonly committed not by a stranger, but by somebody that someone knows, including a family member, even somebody who is mahram and can be alone with them. Now, there are many different types of sexual violence. The 4 most common ones are mentioned here. We're not going to go into too much detail on these different types just out of the nature of the sensitivity of these topics, but I do want to highlight a couple things here. First is that it goes into sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is unwanted sexual attention that one person inflicts on another. This one talks about how this abuse can impact a person, what to do if they feel like they're in this situation. And there's several resources that are offered. There's child sexual abuse. This is when an adult or an older adolescent abuses a child in a sexual way. This part goes into understanding children are not capable of giving consent, that the common perpetrators of the abuse is a mahram or a family member and takes advantage of that relationship. What the effects are of child abuse and how to receive help. The next is sexual assault, when someone intentionally engages in a sexual act on another person without their consent. Common locations could be in a crowded place, if someone's on a date, places where alcohol and drug is offered, even in a marriage it can occur. It can occur on college campuses as well. Talks about how common it is. That again, the ones who typically commit it are not strangers. The effects that this can have on a person, what to do if someone is a victim, how to protect oneself, talks about self-defense class, carrying a weapon, certain things that people can be aware of, also keeping in mind that it's never your fault, that these things, when they happen, they are solely the fault of the perpetrator. And then finally is sex trafficking. This is a form of modern day slavery where a person is forced to engage in sexual acts. The importance of this is particular how it occurs is typically with online predators. So if you have youth who are online and talking to strangers and continue to talk and they meet in person, sex trafficking typically occurs in this type of fashion, and how to protect oneself. And as I mentioned, there are several resources, Muslim and non-Muslim based, that talk about or that are shared within this chapter as well as at the end. Section 3 then goes into the Islamic ruling that Islam recognizes sexual violence as a crime, that it is morally abhorrent and punishable under the Sharia law, gives some of the prophetic and Quranic evidence behind the punishments for it, that a victim is not to be harmed, blamed, shunned. They are deserved to be believed and supported and protected by the community. And also for certain individuals who are victims of sexual violence, and how can they seek closure from Allah, certain advice about the justice of Allah, that Allah is al-adil, Allah will always give you justice, making dua, talking about certain types of boundaries that one can create within even their own family, the permissibility of boundaries, so that way they are protected and safe, the importance of telling somebody if something happened as a means of protecting others. And then finally is advocacy, advocating for those who are victims or survivors of sexual violence, that it is a duty as a Muslim to stand up and speak out against all forms of oppression and injustice, and also to acknowledge that sexual violence happens to Muslims by family members, close friends, even religious members, imams, Quran teachers. In addition, men are as likely as women to be victims of sexual violence. Unfortunately, there are very few statistics on how often sexual violence occurs in the Muslim community, perhaps due to stigma, that victims may fear that if they speak up, they will be blamed, they won't be believed, they'll be told you're making a big deal, everybody goes through this, saying you're unworthy of being married, being told, your reputation is going to be tarnished because of this, or if the perpetrator was a religious leader, that you're going to tarnish their reputation, they fear being disowned. So there's a lot of stigma that can come from this, which can lead to Muslims not speaking out. Alhamdulillah, over the last several years, the Muslim community has become quite receptive to acknowledging sexual violence in the Muslim community, holding perpetrators accountable, advocating for the rights of survivors to be heard and given justice. And this has actually led more Muslims to come forward, and our communities becoming safer as a result of that. Finally, is there some important ways to advocate for survivors is to believe them. Research has found that it's far more common for a survivor of sexual assault to decline to report it than to make it up, or than to have a false accusation. To encourage them to tell their parents or tell an authority, encourage them to get help, even with a mental health professional, to protect them. That even if, especially if it's a child, that if you see or hear someone being sexually abused or assaulted, report it to the authorities, especially if the victim is a child. And actually, the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding, it found that Muslims are actually more likely to report such incidents to law enforcement at 54% compared to other religious groups. So our religion that advocates for justice and protection of other individuals, we see that when it comes to protecting certain victims. And then finally is to reclaim your faith, that if an abuser was Muslim or a religious leader, remind the victim that they don't speak for Islam. Heinous crimes by others can really grossly undermine a person's faith. But keep in mind that their actions are a violation of Islamic teachings. And so reclaim their faith and help them to remember that Allah is aware of them abusing their spiritual power. Finally is men as advocates. When it comes to sexual violence, majority of the time, the victim is a woman. Violence against women, it's not a women's issue, it's a human issue, and it's something in which men can hold other men accountable and protect women. And so this goes into the discussion actually of manhood and masculinity in Islam. Some examples of how masculinity is defined in Islam are mentioned in this chapter, such as a man loves for others what he loves for himself. A man does not boast or incite fear in others. There's prophetic evidence as well on men do not insult others. A man controls himself. A man shows his emotions. A man treats women well. A man does not objectify women. There is this well-known story of the Prophet ﷺ talking to a young man in Medina who asked for permission to commit zina. And the Prophet ﷺ said, would you like this for your mother, your daughter, your sister, your aunt? And he said, no. And then this hadith, it's about humanizing women, and it's about instilling empathy in certain men that objectify women. For males, asking the women in your life, have you ever been a victim of sexual assault or harassment? How do you feel? Be a part of that discussion, hear their stories, how it made them feel. So you have a better understanding of what they go through and how you as a man can protect and even hold yourself accountable. And that moves into the last point is men holding other men accountable. Men have an Islamic duty to be protectors, to be qawam. There's beautiful examples in the seerah of men standing up for women who are not even mahram, who are non-mahram when they are in dangerous or situations by other men. And so teaching our young Muslim men that is a characteristic that they should have as well. Finally, is to acknowledge and recognize that men are also victims of sexual violence, that it doesn't just occur with females, and if it's not discussed and talked about, that a lot of men live in silence. They act strong or self-sufficient, and so they don't talk about it as much, but it still is something that does happen even within our own community. And so this box talks a little bit about that, shares some resources as well for men. And here is the chapter review. Jazakallah khair for listening and taking the time. If you have any questions or comments at this time, I'd be happy to take them. Jazakallah.
Jazakumullah khair, Doctor. We do have Sister Serene. Go ahead, Sister Serene. The mic is yours.
Hi, thank you so much for the event. It's really one of the great webinars that I have so far listened to. Thanks a lot for all your efforts. Now my question is this. Does the book cover what kind of advices we can give to the victim, or let's say victim of rapes? I mean, you know, they feel this kind of feel of shame and all other things. I mean, and they may kind of go and blame God Almighty not to protect them. Do you have any kind of advices that we can kind of give to the students, or about them if they're being kind of a victim or being raped in the situation?
Yes, Jazakallah khair for your question. So firstly, there is several things that are in this chapter that address that. There actually is firstly a story in the seerah of a woman who was sexually assaulted and how the Prophet ﷺ addressed it, and which serves as an example of how our community is to respond, of which we see he did not blame the victim, he verified the facts, he instilled a punishment on the perpetrator. And then there actually is another section that goes into if someone is in this situation. So first is how to prevent or how to protect oneself, but we highlight that by knowing that some scenarios there is no way to prevent. It's just that it happens and it's no fault of your own. But there are some things to keep in mind as a way of protecting oneself. But then there also is a section that talks about if it happens, how to move forward, what to do. So there's a section that talks about contacting authorities, going to the emergency room, don't take a shower, you have evidence on you, contact authorities, so that way they can take the evidence as soon as possible, etc. So yes, there are lots of tips that are offered as well in this section. And there is a organization called RAINN, RAINN, and alhamdulillah, they agreed to share a lot of their graphics and resources in this section. So their resources are highlighted and their advice is highlighted, which is tips on how to prevent or how to deal with an act of sexual violence.
Jazakumullah kul khair, Doctor. Sister Serene, again, 1 second, please. Please go ahead, Sister Serene.
Thank you so much. One last question. You mentioned that you already put the punishment that Sharia gives to the perpetrators who committed rape. I might have some kind of false information about it, but kind of they say that Islam is not that much kind of severe about punishing this crime. Is it true, or can you just give a little brief information? What kind of punishment does Islam, give to the punishment to the perpetrators?
Sure. So the punishment for sexual violence is mentioned in Surah Ma'idah, verse 33, where it says, indeed, the penalty for those who wage war against Allah and His Messenger. This is known as ightisab. Ightisab is that which leads to a lack of safety for the community, and it includes lots of different crimes, one of which includes sexual violence. So for one who commits this crime, it says, and spread mischief in the land is death, crucifixion, cutting off their hands and feet on opposite sides, or exile from the land. This penalty is a disgrace for them in this world, and they will suffer a tremendous punishment in the hereafter. So this verse mentions 4 different types of punishments. Scholars say that the ruler or the judge in that Islamic government, in other words, that bases its penal rulings off of Sharia, can look at the case, decide which punishment is most fitting. It's also important to note that sexual violence is not at all the same as zina, that the punishment for public zina by 4 witnesses is needed, and that is consensual relations. Sexual violence does not involve witnesses. It can testimony of the victim is sufficient, and so sometimes that tends to be clumped together. But these are 2 completely different situations, 2 completely different crimes. But yeah, so the evidence here is in Surah Ma'idah, verse 33. There's also a story in the Sirah of a woman who was a victim of sexual assault, and the Prophet ﷺ, how he dealt with that manner. That story is also highlighted in the chapter 2.
Jazakumullah khair, Dr. Amber. It seems we don't have any more questions. Jazakumullah khair, all of you, for attending. It was a joy for us to be in the company of Dr. Amber. Thank you so much, Doctor, for sharing with us your knowledge regarding these critical issues. Jazakumullah kul khair again. And please join us for the level 6 webinar next week, inshallah, before Ramadan. And may Allah bless you all, inshallah, and have a great day, inshallah. Jazakumullah kul khair. Assalamu alaikum.